Episode 3 from the Lessons from Hindu History. The last time we learned from Sandeep Balakrishna about the misplaced Hindu generosity that turned brilliant victories into defeats and also the origin of Hindu phobia. Today, we have two new lessons to learn. Let's go straight to Sandeep Balakrishna and find out what exactly they are going to be. Before that, I urge you to please subscribe, and I also urge you to go down to the description and check the links over there for contribution as well as for following our social media handles. Okay, welcome Sandeep ji and namaste everyone here.
Namaste, thank you. Glad to be back here.
Okay, so last time we heard from you about two very important lessons from Hindu history, the misplaced generosity as well as the origin of Hindu phobia. So, what do you have for us in this particular episode?
All right, your announcement brochure says lesson number 5, which is the emergence of a new class of Indians for now. Just as introductory, this new class was this new class was created. It is known as Zimmi by the invaders. This class was created by the invaders who unfortunately became the rulers. So this is lesson number 5. Lesson number 6 is something called the extinction of the classical Hindu era. So these are the two lessons we have today. So you let me know where you want to begin and then take it forward
Yeah,
from
so
there.
talking about the Zimmi, of course, we know about the Zimma, which is pronounced as Zimma and in Arabic. And people actually do not know the difference between the Arabic pronunciation and the Urdu pronunciation. So a lot of them get confused. So this Zimma was actually arrived at between Omar and the Christians in the Levant, which is
Yeah,
today's Syria and part of Iraq, what is
yeah.
also called Sham by the Arabs.
Mm.
And this Zimma was also articulated as such. Otherwise, it has always existed as part of their lore. But it was particularly articulated as code of Shah-e Hamadan in Kashmir in 14th century. And of course, we know this as the Pact of Omar. So, how did this come to be applied in India? We are very curious to find out.
Okay, so one way of understanding, this class of people known as Zimma or Zimmi. Zimmi are the people. Zimma is the doctrine. So
Yeah.
Zimmi or Dhimmi. So one way to understand that is that it is the political or statecraft equivalent of what are known as kafirs. Fundamentally, Zimmas are kafirs who have been allowed to live as kafirs under extremely degrading conditions, because the ruling class is, of course, the Islamic class, the Muslim, under a proper Muslim government, under Islamic government. So Zimmis can also be understood in terms of, generally, very, very crudely speaking, as the number of kafirs are so enormous that although the power of Allah and Muhammad's holy warriors, although they got a military victory and acquired what you call monarchical power, got political power, the numbers of kafirs are just too much that it is impossible to either convert all of them into the only true religion or to physically eliminate them. So you let them live as with a status which is slightly higher than that of a full scale slave. So this is Zimmi. I mean, that is both the theory and practice. And in practice, it was horrifying, as we shall, we'll see as we go along. But this class of Zimmi, it was first, and again, once again, we come back to the, first episode where we saw two lessons. ties in back, ties back neatly to that, all the way up to this Zimmi class. So we can recall how, during Muhammad bin Qasim's raid, it was not an invasion, it was a raid. There were no Zimmis back then because, he came, he saw, he kind of, vandalized, looted, and went back. In 3 years, it was all over. And then Hindus, largely began to reclaim their lands. And then the next big epoch comes with Mahmud's invasion. And we have, spoken at length about the kind of savage destruction that he did across North India, all the way up to Somnath in Gujarat. Even at that time, there were no, it was not a lasting or a permanent kind of invasion. It was not exactly a conquest in the sense that we are familiar with the word conquest. It was not exactly a conquest. It was again an invasion, but on a much larger scale, on a much more organized and determined and brutal scale. So that was Mahmud. After that, we come to Muhammad of Ghori. So that era, actually, he did the work that Mahmud had left unfinished. So for the first time, after Ghori also invades India several times, not once or twice. He invades several times repeatedly. I mean, he goes back to his capital in Afghanistan, then comes back again, then goes back, then comes back. So it keeps repeating. But in one of his invasions, he puts Kutubuddin Aibak, one of his slaves, as in charge of his territories in India, with the so-called capital as Delhi. It was still not a capital of the so-called Muslim Sultanate. It was more like a seat of power, what you call a seat of authority from which he could, like a country manager of an MNC, largely speaking. So this was Kutubuddin Aibak in Delhi, and it was during his time that this new class of native Hindus, who get a different identity, a degrading identity, which was created by this Islamic doctrine, and they get to be called Zimmis, or no, like I said, I mean, whatever scholarly and historical literature says that defines Dhimmi as all non-Muslims who enjoy second-rate citizenship. It is not second-rate in by any stretch of imagination, and we look at some of those facets as we go along. So it was during Kutubuddin Aibak's time that a good part of North and Northwestern India, especially Lahore, for example, had, by Kutubuddin Aibak's time, Lahore was emerging as a new hub for slave trade. So you had other places like Bukhara, Iraq, some places in Saudi Arabia, all the way up to Egypt. So Lahore emerges as this new lucrative and emerging market for slavery. And who are these slaves? As we already saw, these are Hindus who were captured in the war and then sold off as slaves. Okay, so that is the other side of it. Now coming back, and it was during Aibak's time that this new class was identified as such and treated, given this so-called citizenship non-rights during Aibak's time. So this happened roughly in the area of Delhi and its surroundings, some parts of what is today known as Bundelkhand, and of course Lahore and northwestern part of original Bharatavarsha. So roughly this class of Zimmis are spread across this geography, wherever Aibak's rule, or rather Muhammad Ghori's rule, indirectly has a presence. He appoints Muslim governors to all those places. in order to enforce this Zimmi status on the infidels. So that is, in brief, uh, the emergence of the origins of this new class of Hindus, who are known as Zimmis.
So actually, we know for Zimmis, we know that the original Zimma was basically arrived at with the people of the book, that is, with the
Hmm.
Jews and Christians. And
Yeah, the chosen
out of
ones.
the four Sunni mazhabs, there's only one, the Hanafi, which is of course also the biggest one. That
Uh,
allows the
Sanjay ji,
uh,
can
grant
you
of.
speak a little louder or
Oh,
increase the
okay.
volume? Yeah,
Yeah. So is it okay now?
yeah.
Yeah. So what I was saying was that this original Zimmichud was extended only to the people of the book, that is the Jews and the Christians,
Yes.
and it was only in the Hanafi mazhab that
Hmm.
it was also extended to the mushrikeen, that is the
Hmm.
idol worshippers, as
Yeah,
uh,
shirk.
they call us.
Hmm.
So, would you say that this new Zimmi class that developed after a permanent kind of outpost was established in
Hmm.
Delhi, would you
Hmm.
say that these are the collaborators?
The Zimmis were the collaborators. Is that what you're saying?
Is this the new class of collaborators that was granted the status of Zimmi?
Well, they fell into different categories, but in the early years, it is difficult to classify them as collaborators. See, one thing with the fall of Prithviraj Chauhan, there was no central Hindu political authority, and we saw that last time. So, what used to happen in the process that all these new dynasties began to emerge, and some exist. Can you give me a second, please? One
Yeah.
second.
Yes. Sure. Sure.
New dynasties, the political configuration kept changing over and over. It kept changing, and without this kind of central authority, what they were doing, some of these old what you call feudals or vassals of Prithviraj Chauhan, some of them, they wanted revenge. Others wanted to kind of, protect their existing possessions or territory or whatever you want to call it. That then the third class were class of Hindus were basically those who had, agreed to take service in the new regime, in the new Muslim regime. Okay, so all those, it depended. I mean, it depends on which time period we're talking about. But since we are in the early stages, Aibak and the infant Delhi Sultanate. So, I mean, if you will, at that time, some of them, yes, were kind of collaborators, but they fell in different categories. One category was key. Okay, as long as admit, I submit to this Zimmi status, I'll still be allowed to follow my ancestral Dharma. That's one. That was one class. Then the second class were, of course, what you call collaborators, those Hindu powers, political powers, who thought, they could grab another rival Hindu's territory by collaborating with this new guy, with this new Muslim king. So there is no way you can, classify this entire Hindu Zimmi population into one neat watertight compartment. That is not possible.
What was the effect of this emergence of this new class?
Okay, great question. So the effect was multi-pronged. One was that it completely, remember that we spoke about the loss of Aryavarta consciousness. that Hindus always had a belief that some Chakravarti or some savior like Parashurama or Shri Krishna will take an avatar, come and drive out these mlechas. And the fact that this Aryavarta could never be conquered, because by itself it was holy and it could withstand anything. So this notion was shattered with the loss of Aryavarta consciousness. Now 300 years after that loss, or 320 years after that loss, what happened to this new Zimmi class was that, I mean, you transport yourself back to that period. Imagine you are a devout Hindu living in that period. And remember, it was an era of faith and belief. Okay. The What these serial Islamic invasions did was to chop off or threaten the very foundations of this belief. So now the one big impact was psychological for the Zimmis, that this is a system. This is not even dharma. I mean, you might be a subject of a new king or a new regime, but he would treat you, allow you to maintain and carry on your old traditions undisturbed. But this was completely new, and the fact that all these, it was unthinkable for people, to Hindus of that time, to that someone would even come and destroy temples and slaughter cows and things like that. So it took a lot of time. First, it played a devastating impact on their psyche, and it took a lot of time for these Hindus, now turned into Zimmis, to even understand the nature of the beast. So that was, I think, perhaps the most profound and the most deadly impact, long-term kind of impact, on the psyche of the Zimmis. That several generations were created, which, or rather, that was the starting point. This whole creation of the Zimmi thing, identity. It was a starting point for a certain kind of weakening of the Hindu spirit at the on the level of the larger Hindu society.
Yeah, okay.
Hmm.
Yes, please carry on.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, now, since you mentioned it, we have a full articulation of that in the
Hmm.
Code of Shah Hamadan in 14th century Kashmir,
Hmm.
where he lays out those 16 points, which are
Hmm.
identical, almost identical to the Pact of Umar. Things like you shall not construct new temples, and you shall uh, wish a Muslim when you come next to him that you shall have an
Hmm.
distinct identity, like Hitler
Hmm.
ordained for the Jews, and that you
Jews.
shall uh,
Hmm.
not do public worship of your faith, that you will not carry out processions, things like that, generally a degradation of sorts. And what is called a codification of that degradation. And you saw how quickly, unlike the mainland, how quickly Kashmir succumbed.
Hmm.
And I think within a matter of about a century, they were reduced to a minority.
Hmm.
Now, this signs of zimmitude.
Hmm.
Why is it that the signs of zimmitude, this urge to placate and pacify the aggressor,
Hmm.
persists till date? Is it a
Okay.
transgenerational trauma, or
Hmm.
is it some kind of a political ploy on part of the powers that be? Because we see this urge to get validation even from the so-called champions of Hindutva.
Okay. So there are two aspects to Zimmi. One thing is what you mentioned, Zimmitude. I'll come to that a little later. What I was speaking of, when I began this submission, was Zimmi as Zimmi, the doctrine of Zimma, in Islamic theory and political, application, practical application. So this Zimmi, you speak, I forgot his name, that Kashmiri guy who codified it. Okay,
Yeah, Shah
uh,
Hamadan,
yeah,
Ali
14th
Muhammad
century.
Hamdani.
So right, so slightly about a decade before this guy codified it, right? It was already put in practice by Alauddin Khalji. Okay, his clergy made it a point to enforce this zimmi status upon infidels, and this thou shalt not look at a Mussalman in the eye, you should not wear good dresses, you can't ride horses, you can't carry weapons, you can't carry except your knife for cutting vegetables, this kind of thing, you can't carry vegetables, and Hindus must be subjected to the most degrading humiliations possible, like when a tax collector comes for collecting taxes, the Hindu should open his mouth, and if the tax collector spits inside his mouth, he must swallow the saliva and must not show disgust on his face. So this was already in practice, implemented on the kafirs in Delhi, and generally in wherever Alauddin Khalji's direct authority existed. So it was already in practice. So that is one thing. The second thing is how Zimmis viewed this, what you call dhimmitude. Like I said, it derives from a psychological condition that you are used to a certain way of life, what you call a certain normal, for centuries, not just decades, for centuries. That is uprooted in such a brutal, such a savage fashion that you don't know how to deal with it. And then your oppressor continues to oppress you, not just for one generation, but two, three, four generations. So what happens then is that by Alauddin Khalji's time, what had happened to Hindus, generally speaking, in the North India, was that while they reluctantly agreed to Alauddin Khalji and other people's overlordship and whatever, right? That they had accepted Sultan. Heart of heart, they could have converted. They had an option to convert. So the other idea of Zimmi is to degrade, because you're in such a degraded status. You're economically squeezed. You're politically powerless, right? You can't own a military. You can't fight back. You don't have citizenship. You have no rights, right? You're a semi-slave. So what is the only way to escape this slavery? To convert to Islam. All these bonds are gone. All these restrictions are gone. You immediately become elevated, so to speak. But the fact that there existed this large class of Zimmis, meaning Hindus, meant how deeply they were attached to their Dharma. That is the other side of it. So, for some centuries, about 2.5, 3 centuries in North India, while these Hindu Zimmis, while they accepted this Muslim rule, heart of heart, they would side and they would wait for every opportunity where a good Hindu leadership emerged, and they would join that leadership. That fact is also there in our history. For example, Balban. Balban had Hindu, Hindu employees, of course, Zimmis basically, in his hunting party, his personal hunting party. He would be escorted by Hindu warriors. He tried as hard to kind of convert them. They didn't convert, but because they were so valuable, they were so skilled and brave, he enlisted them in his private hunting party. So some of these people, when they saw this, after Balban's death until Jalaluddin Khalji came to power, right? In that intervening period, some 6-7 years or less than that maybe, in that intervening period, these people, the Hindus in Hindu officials in the Delhi Sultanate, in Balban Sultanate, they began to align themselves with whichever Muslim party that was fighting for the throne, for succession. In that, they thought that, somehow if we keep elevating ourselves, we would somehow manage to come back to power. This fact is also there. So this dimitude that you're speaking of, which became deep rooted, occurred over a much longer period, and it occurred not all at once, but it was a phenomenon that gradually spread over centuries. But the full credit for internalizing dimitude and pleasing the oppressor must go to Mohandas Gandhi, nobody else. Because remember, yeah, because remember, until this Mahatma arrived on the scene, Hindus never recognized Islam as a valid religion.
Right.
So, yeah, that's about it.
Oh, that's okay. We know the contributions of Mahatma. I think we've discussed it also, and you've written extensively on the great contributions of the Mahatma towards fashioning or turning Zimmichud into an art form.
Yeah,
But I also
I'll have
asked about the
before I forget,
post-independence era,
one
not
second.
just the post-independence era. Even in the 21st century, it persists.
Hmm. Well, some viruses are hard to cure, and when that virus is injected by a alleged Mahatma, and the virtually the entire freedom movement, a major part of the freedom movement is infected by this virus, which assumes a more malign form, a more malignant form under Nawab Nehru, who fashions, the political apparatus and whatever other narrative, mainstream narrative, based on this kind of dimitude. It is hard to shake off, believe me. It is really difficult to shake off. Look, the main difference is that Hindus were Hindus until Gandhi arrived. Hindus were Hindus in the sense that they were believers. Our forefathers, at least till the mid 19th century, our ancestors, they never had any illusions of being this rational Hindu. I'm an atheist, but I'm a Hindu. It doesn't make sense at all. They saw fundamentals. They saw, okay, we revere the cow. They make it a point to slaughter it. We worship murtis. They make it a point to destroy temples and murtis. So it was a matter of faith. We kept them alive. Now it's a different thing that you discuss whether Hinduism is a faith or a way of life, or some philosophy or some Veda. That is an entirely different discussion. This is a civilizational, social, and community-based aspect that we are discussing now. So until the mid 19th century, Hindus were believing Hindus. Okay, they knew there was fundamentally something intrinsically correct or strong in our roots. So unfortunately, the one big contributor to what you mentioned, that even in as we speak in today, I mean in the contemporary age, that this dimitude persists, is because of this. Neither did we understand so-called Hindu leaders from those days, from more than a century. Neither did they understand or the place of rationality and scientific temper. So they thought, these two things can coexist. They can coexist, but there is something called a place for everything. Look, because I have a plate made of gold, I will not go into my, I won't sit on the WC and eat food from that. I won't sit on the toilet seat and eat food because I have a plate made of gold. So there is a place for everything. So, what happened? You lost the faith, the innate Shraddha, not faith, the innate Shraddha that our ancestors had till the mid 19th century. Neither did you get the complete understanding or know the right place to put all these things, rationality and this intellectual, whatever fancy words, theories that that the West has evolved. So you lost both. What are you left with? Then you had this Nehru worship and then secularism. So you're nowhere now. So dimitude, well, I hope that makes sense in a way.
At the risk of laboring this point a little
Okay.
further, I would actually look at the Ram Mandir movement, which
Mm,
was, I think, a great resurgence of Shraddha, and it happened all over India.
mm,
But even then, we find that we're still stuck with that
mm,
Zimmi mindset. Would you say that even those who are actually from the so-called right, so-called Hindu right, even they seem to be stuck in the same framework from which the denigrators of Hinduism come? And because they are trying to challenge uh, these people from the same framework, so willy-nilly they end up seeking their validation, and because of that similitude persists.
well, true. Absolutely. I mean, you asked a question, you answered it yourself. So,
Okay, so let's move to the next point now. The
okay.
end of the classical era, the extinction of the
Mm,
classical era, as you put it.
extinction, yeah. Mm. Extinction of the classical era. Now, it was the natural and logical consequence of the loss of Aryavarta consciousness. So, the classical era can be defined as uh, the period from the dawn of the Vedic civilization all the way up to the downfall of the Gupta dynasty. So, with the Gupta dynasty, the Gupta Empire, when it disintegrated and new big empires, small empires, medium-sized empires, when all of them emerged, this Aryavarta consciousness was long destroyed. So it was just a matter of time. So you look at, see, one way to understand this is to look at what we regard as our cultural inheritance, mainly in the realm of literature, art, music, the celebration of festivals, some of the fundamental Puranas that we have. All of these that we are following in whatever form today have their origins in the Gupta period. It is undeniable. Over the course of so many centuries, they might have altered in form and in the outward methods of expression, but the real source is there in the Gupta period. So when that empire fell, it was just a matter of time. Even Vildurant says that India was waiting for an invasion and for Muslim invasion, and they did not disappoint. So he says that in a very sarcastic fashion. So this classical era, extinction of the classical era, meant that all the foundations on which the classical era had stood, political, economic, military, and culture, and society, of course, all the all that foundation was gone. Rather, it was shaking, and as with successive Muslim raids, when this sort of an alien cult comes, a military cult, an imperialistic religious cult comes and annihilates everything, pretty much everything. It values nothing. It doesn't value beauty. It doesn't value truth. Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram. All these are aliens to the alien notions to them. So that finished off this classical era. You look at other Hindu empires that arose, including Vijayanagara. which protected South India from Islamic invasion. Even there, it is not, this classicism was not revived in any fundamental sense. Okay, so what Vijayanagara Empire did was to, in essence, rejuvenate and restore that past. But that original thing was long gone. Because with the loss of political power, it's a big thing. Loss of political power, especially to an Abrahamic violent cult like Islam, means that there is physical loss, enormous amount of physical loss. Let's look at the example. I think I mentioned in some lecture or some piece on Dharma Dispatch that Mulasthana or Multan. Okay, that was by the time Muhammad bin Qasim raided it. He captured Multan. By the time he raided it, 8th century AD. So by that time, Multan was a Tirtha Kshetra with a minimum history of 600 years. So 8th century minus 600 years in the past. So it enjoyed the same status in the Hindu psyche as Ayodhya, Kashi, Kanchipuram, Rameshwaram, Prayagraj. It enjoyed the same status. The temple is not there. And even worse, today's Multan is the world's only place which has the largest collection of Sufi shrines and monuments. So this is what I meant, in practice, in real life. This is what I meant, this is how we can explain this extinction of classical era. I hope that makes sense. Or
Yes, that does make sense. But how do you reckon that to be a lesson? Because that's an historical fact that happened. What do we learn from that?
what we learn is, how do I put it? The lesson we learn from it is the lesson to go back and dig out all the facets, all the elements, all the ingredients that built classical India. That is a lesson.
Okay, so could you elaborate? I mean, how do we go about it? I mean, what
Well,
exactly?
there is lot,
Say,
there is
let's
lot of
let's take an example of art forms, or let's say Shilpa, and
hmm.
would you make out a case of how we can revive that Shilpa and bring that classicism back?
Okay, the good news is that a lot of research has already been done on this classical Gupta art, Gupta architecture, sculpture, or even pre-Gupta, Satavahana, all these people. So Kushana art, for example. So a lot of research has already been done. The point is that it is lying right in our backyard. From that, and the traditional body of knowledge required to recreate that classicism, okay, is still, it exists among practitioners, but that the number of those practitioners are quickly dwindling. So you provide them with a good livelihood, create specialized education, for those who are make it lucrative. Okay, and the most important thing is that these temples which were built, and all our uh, uh, other art forms, literature, poetry, all that. Okay, they were done by practicing Hindus, in the sense that a sculptor did not merely build a sculpture or a temple. It was his way. He was a devout Hindu. He said, I'll earn punya by doing this. I will earn moksha by building this. It was a pious act. It was a sacred endeavor. So it is one thing to revive this body of knowledge and pass it on, transmit to future generations. That is one thing. But where will you teach Shraddha? Which school teaches you? Which course teaches you Shraddha? That comes only with practice, from living it. Not by tweeting, all kinds of pictures and giving temples and giving some kind of vague captions. No. So
Okay, let
their
me try and
work
put it
was
another
also,
way.
no, their work was also a reflection of their Shraddha, which is why it is not merely a work of art. It is art that aspires to divinity. Unless you have this, there is no difference between what you call, how do I put it? No, I don't want to use a very crude expression, so I leave it at that. So
You can.
it is,
The crude
no,
expressions are
no,
perfectly allowed here.
no,
We
no,
do
no,
this all the
no,
time.
not necessary. So it is art, which extends to divinity, aspires for divinity. There is a difference between building a house and a temple, right? Even today. So you bring in all these vague notions of, this was that, and, oh, this falls in the realm of faith, and no. You lose a lot of it. You're throwing the baby out of the bath water, basically. So see, this
Uh,
extinction of classical era includes all this.
shall I put it another way? Uh, let me try and frame it in another manner. And that is what we call the Hindu culture as such, or
Hmm.
the Indic culture, the Indian culture,
Hmm.
basically comes from the fundamentals of Sanatan Dharma, and those fundamentals are ultimately reflected in the art, in the literature, in the music, and all of it actually is attempting to make you one with the Supreme, as you mentioned, through a quest for achieving divinity. And that basic lesson seems to have got lost somewhere. And it is because of that that we've lost all the nation of notion today. I'm talking about today. We don't have a notion of how the Hindu culture or the Indic culture is different from the imported culture of the barbarians or even the British. And we mindlessly spout that all religions are the same kind of nonsense, which of course was made popular by your favorite Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. And the basic notions of what we know as the Hindu or Sanatana time concepts, logic concepts, epistemology, cosmology, eschatology, they seem to be lost. And that openness, that open quest for seeking, that seeking rather than blind believing, the experiential framework, as we call it, that experiential framework as opposed to the intellectual framework that has been brought in by the West or even by the barbarians, the appreciation is lost, and that is the loss of the sense of the classicism. Would you agree to that?
Largely, yes. Largely, yes. Look, the point, what you're speaking of, epistemology, cosmology, uh, abstract philosophy, Vedanta, call it what you will. It was, how do I put it? It was not in the popular imagination, so to say, so to speak. Like, it didn't look, these concepts, okay, these contemplations and their outcomes could be understood. And I can't say use the word understood, because it when you say understanding, it directly relates to your mind and intellect. So these are things that transcend intellect, and like you rightly said, it's experiential. But how many people, even in a village of 200 people, How many are even interested to, talk about Vedanta, or, listen to a lecture on Vedanta? No. What Vedanta, what the real thing that preserved, that helped, that nurtured Sanatana Dharma, and, led to the flowering of this grand civilization and culture, was how Vedanta was transmitted, was transformed first into practical applications in real life, in daily
Right.
life.
Right.
Okay,
Absolutely.
that comes, yeah, that comes through art, literature. Ramayana and Mahabharata. India was not, Hindu culture was not preserved through Vedas, or, Bhagavad Gita, whatever, all these big words that people use. Okay, with due respect to all those philosophers. Our culture and civilization, what still maintains it are our epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata and Puranas.
Right.
Okay, this is the whole point, right? Look, even 40, 50 years ago, it was very common. I think it's still common in North India, not so much here, that the advent of television, radically altered a lot of things. That it was very common that a stranger, a Harikatha person, or a person who would give discourses on Puranas, he would be a stranger to your village. He'll come to a village and he'll introduce himself. And he'll say, "Look, I'm so and so." So immediately they provide him with food and a place to stay. Next day, he'll sit under the banyan tree or something like that, some central place in the village, and deliver a few discourses. This was enough. So imagine this, such people, and I'm taking just one example of these Puranikas. We call them Puranikas here. So imagine this occurred, this was a common phenomenon throughout lakhs of villages in India. So this is what kept our culture and whatever you want, all these nice things alive. Not so much Vedanta, although that is the base of it. So this is something that transcends intellect, and it is something that is beyond your intellect and your what you call as rationality and this whole analysis, that kind of thing. No, it appeals to a place that is so deep inside you that you cannot identify it, but it exists and it appeals. You know it exists when you feel the appeal.
Quite right.
Yeah.
I think we are nearing the end of our discussions. Well, there
Oh,
aren't
already.
many questions. In fact, there's only one question so far. So I urge people to ask more questions if they will. Meantime,
Hmm.
I will ask you the one question that I have, and
Hmm.
from the audience.
Okay.
And yes,
Good.
this is Amit Tripathi. Sir, namaste.
Hmm.
When we will feel pride as Hindu, not as a caste?
I'm not sure I understood this question fully.
Yes, I
See,
mean
when you
what he says that when are we going to privilege our Sanatana identity over our caste identity? I think that's the question.
okay, so this whole point about caste, again, it goes back to the British narrative that you take a unified society. For the longest time, and this is an unpopular view, but it is true, unfortunately, can't help it. It is this uh, amazing network of jati and janajati, which kept the Hindu society alive. Okay, no matter what this, look, this caste war and hardening of caste identities uh, is a much later development. So even if you call yourself as identify yourself as some caste, you're still a Hindu, as simple as that. As long as you don't worship, desert cults, okay, unknown jealous male god, and his in the case of Christianity, some ghost. Okay, as long as you don't do that, as you worship all the gods that emerged on this soil, then there's no reason to break your head over caste. Simple. You are a Hindu, you will remain a Hindu.
Right. I think one more question here, Oriental Arm. Why do Hindus not learn from their collective misfortune? What is preventing our consciousness from growing?
Uh, Interesting. Why do Hindus not learn from their collective misfortune? Because we don't, even after independence, we have not definitively declared that India is a Hindu country. Whatever you want to call it, you codify this, the fundamental impulse. In fact, the only thing that keeps India politically and geographically united till date is this Hindu DNA, this collective civilizational memory. That is all. That is all which preserves. So, you word and we are not Hindu Rashtra, this is also that, that is also this, we are also secular, this is all nonsense basically. And what is preventing, I think, okay, what is preventing our consciousness to grow? This divisive politics, there's no doubt about it.
Okay, so with that, we come to the end of the session. Thank you very much, and we'll meet
Mm-hmm.
next Tuesday again at the same time, 7 p.m., for the fourth episode.
Mm-hmm.
You remember there are 10 lessons, and we have reached six lessons so far in three
Six.
episodes, so two more episodes to go. Thank you very
Mhm.
much, Sandeep ji, and thank you
Thank
very
you,
much,
Sanjay
all
ji.
the
A pleasure, a
viewers.
delight as always. Jai Shri Ram.
Jai Shri Ram.